The morning the trial began, Cedar Falls felt different. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the town like a heavy thought no one wanted to finish. Outside the county courthouse, news vans lined the street, their antennas raised like metal fingers pointing at the building. Reporters spoke in hushed but excited tones, practicing lines they had repeated for weeks. Everyone knew the case. Everyone had an opinion. And almost everyone believed the same thing. The man walking into the courthouse that morning was a murderer. Daniel Morris stepped through the metal detectors with his head down. He looked thinner than he had in the photos that flooded social media after his arrest. His dark hair, once neatly kept, was now uneven, cut by prison clippers. He wore a borrowed gray suit that didn't quite fit, the sleeves ending just above his wrists. His hands trembled as he held a folder of papers he barely understood. 6 months earlier, he had been a quiet accountant with a predictable life. Now, his name was spoken with disgust in grocery stores and whispered in school hallways. Behind him, the gallery began to fill. Eleanor Morris's parents sat in the front row, holding each other's hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Her mother stared straight ahead, her eyes dry and distant, as if she had already cried every tear she had. Her father looked older than his years, his shoulders bent forward under a weight no parent should ever carry. A framed photograph of Eleanor rested on the bench beside them, placed there with the judge's permission. In it, she was smiling, sunlight catching in her dark hair, her eyes full of warmth and life. It was hard to believe that the woman in the photo had been dead for half a year. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. The air felt thick as everyone sat back down. The case of State versus Daniel Morris was officially underway. The prosecution began by laying out what seemed like a clear story. Eleanor Morris, a beloved school librarian, was found dead in her apartment on a quiet Sunday night. There were signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and neighbors reported hearing raised voices earlier that evening. Daniel, her husband of 5 years, claimed he had been out of town visiting his brother, but there were gaps in his timeline. To many, it sounded simple. Too simple. As the prosecutor spoke, Daniel stared at the defense table, barely blinking. Every word felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin he feared was already closed. His lawyer whispered reassurances, but they sounded far away, like voices underwater. Then came the moment no one expected. The prosecutor, a woman known for her calm and controlled presence, stepped closer to the jury box. She paused, letting silence stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. "Members of the jury," she said, "this case is about truth. And sometimes, the truth comes from places we least expect." She turned slightly toward the judge. "Your Honor, the state would like to call its key witness." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The prosecutor faced the courtroom again. "We call Eleanor Morris." For a second, no one reacted. The words seemed to float in the air, meaningless. Then confusion spread like a ripple through water. People shifted in their seats. A reporter dropped his pen. Someone laughed softly, then stopped when no one else joined in. Daniel's lawyer stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Objection," he said sharply. "This is inappropriate." The judge frowned. "Counselor, explain yourself," he said to the prosecutor. The prosecutor did not look at Daniel or his lawyer. She looked directly at the jury. "The state is not calling a living witness," she said. "We are presenting recorded testimony left by the victim herself." The room erupted. Voices overlapped, disbelief turning into shock. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. It took nearly a full minute for silence to return. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he felt dizzy. His mouth went dry. He turned toward the prosecutor, searching her face for some sign that this was a trick, a misunderstanding. But her expression didn't change. She looked certain, confident. The judge leaned forward. "Recorded testimony?" he asked carefully. "From the victim?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied. "A recording made by Eleanor Morris prior to her death, intended to be released only if she could no longer speak for herself." Daniel's lawyer objected again, his voice loud and urgent. He argued that such evidence was unreliable, emotional, and unfairly prejudicial. He said it would poison the jury before facts could be properly examined. He said it violated the very idea of a fair trial. The judge listened without interrupting. When the lawyer finished, the courtroom waited. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the judge spoke. "I will allow the state to make an offer of proof," he said. "The jury will hear the recording. After that, we will address admissibility." A murmur spread through the room. The prosecutor nodded once and signaled to the technician. Daniel felt as if the floor beneath him had shifted. He had prepared himself to hear accusations from the living, not from the woman he loved. Elena's voice existed only in his memories now. Also, he thought. The lights dimmed slightly. A speaker crackled to life. At first, there was nothing but a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against a microphone. Then came breathing. Slow, uneven breathing. It sounded nervous. Human. Then a voice spoke. "My name is Elena Morris," the voice said quietly. "If you're hearing this, I'm probably dead." A sharp gasp came from the gallery. Elena's mother covered her mouth, her body shaking. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his vision blurring. That was her voice. There was no doubt. He had heard it every day for years. Late at night, early in the morning, whispering his name. The recording continued, each word cutting deeper than the last. "I don't know when this will happen," Elena said, "but I know I'm scared. I've been scared for a long time." Daniel's lawyer sat frozen, his objections forgotten for the moment. The judge's face had gone pale. Elena spoke slowly, carefully, as if she knew every word mattered. She talked about fear that grew quietly, about nights spent awake listening for footsteps, about a feeling that something terrible was waiting just out of sight. She did not scream. She did not cry. That somehow made it worse. Daniel shook his head over and over, silently mouthing no. His hands clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his skin. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the story he knew. The recording ended as suddenly as it began. The room stayed silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The judge cleared his throat, but the sound was weak. The prosecutor turned off the equipment and faced the jury again. "That," she said softly, "is why Elena Morris is our witness." Outside, the gray sky darkened further. Inside the courtroom, something had shifted. The trial had only just begun, and already, the dead had spoken, and nothing would ever be the same again. When the audio recording ended, the silence inside the courtroom felt heavier than noise ever could. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the judge seemed unsure of what to say next, his hand resting on the gavel without lifting it. Elena Morris's voice still lingered in the air, soft but unescapable, as if it had soaked into the walls themselves. Daniel sat frozen. His ears rang, and his heart thudded painfully against his ribs. He wanted to stand up and shout that it wasn't true, that Elena had been afraid of many things, that fear did not mean guilt. But the words would not come. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Around him, people avoided his eyes. The judge finally cleared his throat and called for a short recess. As people stood, the courtroom erupted into low, frantic whispers. Reporters rushed out to send breaking updates. Elena's parents remained seated, holding each other as if standing might cause them to fall apart. Daniel was let out through a side door, his legs weak, his mind spinning. In a small room behind the courtroom, the lawyers gathered. The defense attorney was furious. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, arguing that the recording was nothing more than a dramatic statement made under stress. He said fear was not evidence and that allowing the jury to hear it would destroy any chance of fairness. The prosecutor listened quietly. When he finished, she spoke in a calm voice. She explained that the recording was not a random message or an emotional outburst. It was part of a larger system, one Elena had carefully planned. The state had documents, digital records, and expert testimony to prove it. When the court resumed, the judge allowed the prosecution to explain how the recording came to exist. The prosecutor called her first witness, a cybersecurity specialist named Aaron Blake. He looked uncomfortable under the attention, adjusting his glasses as he took the stand. In simple terms, he explained the service Elena had used. It was an online platform designed for journalists, activists, and people who feared they might be silenced. Users recorded messages and set regular check-ins. If they failed to confirm they were safe, the system would release the message automatically. Elena had registered under her real name. She had recorded the message 3 weeks before her death. The system logged her check-ins until the night she died. After 7 days of silence, the message was sent exactly as designed. Aaron explained the security features. The recording could not be edited after submission. The metadata showed no signs of tampering. The file presented in court was identical to the original stored on the server. The defense tried to poke holes in his testimony. They asked if someone else could have forced Elena to record it. Aaron answered honestly. It was possible, but there was no evidence of that. The tone of the message, the timing, and the technical details all pointed to a voluntary recording. As Aaron stepped down, the courtroom felt tense but focused. The shock of hearing a dead woman speak had settled into something colder and more dangerous, belief. The prosecutor then asked to play the recording again, this time without interruption. The judge allowed it. Elena's voice filled the room once more. This time, people listened differently. They noticed the pauses between her words, the careful way she chose her sentences. She spoke about feeling watched, about arguments that ended with slammed doors and silence that felt louder than shouting. She talked about fear growing slowly, like a shadow stretching across a room. Daniel stared at the table. He remembered those months differently. He remembered stress about money, about long work hours, about small disagreements that never seemed important at the time. Hearing Elena describe them as fear felt like being accused by a stranger wearing his wife's voice. When the recording ended again, the prosecutor did not sit down. She stepped forward and addressed the jury directly. Elena Morris knew she might not be believed, she said. She knew fear alone is not proof. That is why she prepared. That is why she spoke clearly. And that is why she made sure her words would survive even if she did not. The defense objected, claiming the statement was emotional manipulation. The judge sustained part of the objection but allowed the point to stand. As the day continued, more details emerged. The prosecution showed screenshots of Elena's account setup, timestamps, and confirmation emails. Everything matched. Nothing appeared rushed or forced. Elena had planned this calmly, deliberately. Then came testimony from Elena's closest friend, Sarah Lynn. Sarah described changes in Elena's behavior during the last few months of her life. She said Elena became quieter, more careful. She stopped sharing details about her marriage. She started checking locks twice before leaving her apartment. Sarah testified that Elena once mentioned recording something just in case. At the time, Sarah thought it was anxiety talking. She never imagined it would become evidence in a murder trial. Daniel watched Sarah with a mix of anger and sadness. He wanted to ask why she never came to him, why no one told him Elena was that afraid. But the court was not a place for questions from the accused. As the sun lowered outside, the prosecutor rested for the day. The judge dismissed the jury, reminding them not to discuss the case with anyone. As they filed out, some avoided looking at Daniel. Others glanced at him with expressions that had already begun to change. In the hallway, reporters shouted questions. Did you hear the recording? How does it feel to be accused by your dead wife? Daniel was rushed past them, his head down, his ears burning. That night, Daniel sat alone in his holding cell, staring at the wall. Elena's voice replayed in his head over and over. He remembered her laughter, her calm, the way she used to read aloud from her favorite books. The voice in the recording sounded like her, but also not like her. It sounded afraid. Across town, Elena's parents sat at their kitchen table, listening to the evening news replay the same audio clip. Her mother pressed her hands to her ears, but it was too late. The words had already reached her heart. Her father stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. He wanted justice, but he also wanted truth. He prayed the two were the same. Late that night, in a quiet office at the prosecutor's building, the prosecutor herself listened to the recording again. Not as evidence, but as a person. She noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. A hesitation. A breath Elena took before saying certain words. It sounded like doubt. The prosecutor leaned back in her chair, uneasy. The recording was powerful, but it was not complete. Elena had spoken about fear, about knowing who would hurt her. But she had not explained everything. There were gaps, questions unanswered. Somewhere in those missing details, the full truth was waiting. And the dead woman, it seemed, still had more to say. The third day of the trial began without the shock that had defined the first two. There were no gasps when the judge entered, no sudden movements from the gallery. Instead, there was something quieter and more dangerous in the air. Curiosity had turned into scrutiny. The courtroom was no longer reacting emotionally. It was listening carefully, and that shift would change everything. Daniel Morris looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying an invisible weight. The recording of Elena's voice had followed him into sleep, twisting into his dreams and pulling him awake in the early hours of the morning. Each time he replayed her words in his head, he noticed something different. A pause. A tone. A detail that didn't quite fit with the woman he remembered. The prosecutor began the day by calling another expert witness, a digital forensics analyst named Lila Gomez. She spoke clearly, using simple language, careful not to lose the jury in technical terms. Her job, she explained, was to examine electronic evidence and determine its authenticity, timing, and history. She confirmed what the previous expert had said. The primary recording was genuine. It had not been edited or altered. The metadata matched the date the prosecution claimed. But then she added something new. There were additional files associated with Elena Morris's account, Lila said. The courtroom stared. How many? The prosecutor asked. 3 total, Lila replied. All recorded within a short period of time. Daniel's lawyer stiffened. He had not expected this. Neither had the jury. Lila explained that Elena had recorded multiple messages during the same week. Only one was scheduled for automatic release. The others were marked private. One was labeled as a backup. The third was marked as emergency only and required a manual review before being sent. The prosecutor asked the question everyone was thinking. Why are we only hearing about this now? Lila answered carefully. Because one of the files showed signs of an attempted deletion. The room went still. She explained that shortly after Elena's death, someone tried to access her account. The attempt failed due to security measures, but it left a trace. The person did not have full credentials. They guessed incorrectly multiple times and triggered a lockout. The defense immediately objected, arguing there was no proof connecting that attempt to Daniel. The judge agreed and reminded the jury that speculation was not evidence. Still, the idea had been planted. The prosecutor then asked to introduce the second recording. Before it was played, she gave context. This recording, she said, was not an accusation. It was an observation. A concern Elena had expressed privately, not knowing if she would ever use it. The judge allowed it. The audio began. Elena's voice sounded different this time. Less formal. More uncertain. There's someone at work, she said. I don't know if I'm imagining things, but he watches me. He asks questions that feel too personal. He remembers things I don't remember telling him. The jury leaned forward. He's helpful, Elena continued. Too helpful. He walks me to my car even when I say I'm fine. I don't want to make trouble. I don't even know if this matters. But I need to say it somewhere. She paused, then spoke a name. Marcus Hale. Daniel's head snapped up. He recognized the name. Marcus worked at the same school library as Elena. He had met him once or twice at staff events. Quiet. Polite. Easy to overlook. The recording ended without drama. No accusation. No fear-filled declaration. Just unease. The defense seized on this immediately. They argued that Elena herself admitted she might be imagining things. That the recording proved her fear could be misplaced, driven by anxiety rather than danger. They suggested the prosecution was reaching for alternatives because their case was weak. But the prosecutor did not look shaken. She called a detective to the stand, who testified that Marcus Hale had been questioned early in the investigation and released due to lack of evidence. He had an alibi for part of the night, and nothing suspicious was found in his apartment during a brief search. Then the prosecutor asked a simple question. Was his digital footprint examined? The detective hesitated. He admitted it had not been a priority. At the time, the focus was on Daniel, the husband, the obvious suspect. That admission caused a ripple in the courtroom. Daniel felt something shift inside him. For the first time since his arrest, a fragile sense of hope surfaced. If the investigation had focused too narrowly, maybe the truth had been overlooked. The prosecutor then asked Lila to explain the attempted deletion in more detail. Lila clarified that the login attempt came from a device not linked to Daniel. The IP address pointed to a location near the school where Elena worked. Marcus Hale's workplace. The defense objected again, louder this time. The judge reminded the jury that location data could be misleading. But the prosecutor was building something piece by piece, careful not to rush. As the afternoon wore on, more cracks appeared. Phone records showed that Marcus had called Elena several times late at night over the previous months. He claimed they were work-related. Elena had never mentioned them to Daniel. Security footage from the school parking lot showed Marcus often leaving minutes after Elena, even on nights when other staff stayed late. It meant nothing on its own. But combined with Elena's words, it began to feel different. Daniel listened, his emotions tangled. Anger flared, not just at Marcus, but at himself. Had he missed something? Had Elena tried to tell him in ways he didn't understand? Then came the most unsettling revelation of the day. Lila testified that the emergency-only recording had been accessed. Not played. Accessed. Someone had opened the file briefly before closing it. The timestamp placed this access 2 days after Elena's death, during the window when police were still processing evidence. The account had been locked soon after. The prosecutor did not accuse anyone directly. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. The judge called for another recess. In the hallway, reporters spoke in urgent whispers. The story was changing. Headlines that once declared Daniel guilty now asked new questions. Inside the holding area, Daniel sat with his lawyer. For the first time, the lawyer looked thoughtful instead of defensive. He admitted that the prosecution's case was no longer as straightforward as it once seemed. Across town, Marcus Hale sat in his apartment, watching the news. His name had not been mentioned on air yet, but he felt something tightening around him. He turned off the television, his hands shaking slightly. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor made one final move before resting for the day. She requested permission to introduce the emergency-only recording later in the trial. She explained that it required careful consideration due to its sensitive nature. The judge agreed but warned that the court would need to examine its relevance closely. As the day ended, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The story everyone thought they understood was breaking apart. The voice from the grave had opened a door, but what lay behind it was far more complex than anyone expected. Daniel was led away once more, but this time, his steps felt lighter. Somewhere in the cracks of the story, the truth was beginning to show, and it was no longer pointing only at him. By the time the 4th chapter of the trial began, Cedar Falls no longer felt united in its judgment. The certainty that once hung over the town had cracked, replaced by tension and doubt. People still filled the courtroom every morning, but now they arrived early not to witness a conviction, but to see what truth might surface next. The case had stopped being simple. It had become unsettling. Daniel Morris entered the courtroom with a different expression than before. He was still afraid, still exhausted, but something had changed in his eyes. The hopelessness was no longer complete. Each new revelation had loosened the grip of certainty around his guilt, and while he did not yet feel free, he no longer felt alone. The prosecutor began the day carefully. She knew the line she was walking was thin. The case had shifted, but shifting too fast could risk losing the jury. She needed facts, not emotion. Truth, not drama. She called Daniel's brother, Thomas Morris, to the stand. Thomas testified about the night of the murder. He spoke slowly, clearly, describing Daniel's visit in detail. They had eaten dinner together, argued about their father's health, and watched a late-night sports replay. Phone records confirmed the calls made from Thomas's house. Gas station footage placed Daniel on the highway later that night, heading home. For the first time, the timeline made sense. The prosecution did not challenge Thomas aggressively. Instead, they let the evidence speak. Daniel's absence from the apartment during the time Elena was likely killed could no longer be ignored. Then came the moment that shifted the entire courtroom. The prosecutor asked permission to introduce the emergency-only recording. The defense objected immediately. Daniel's lawyer argued that the recording was emotionally charged, speculative, and potentially misleading. The judge called both sides forward. Their discussion was quiet but intense, lasting several minutes. The jury waited, watching every movement. Finally, the judge returned to his seat. "The recording will be allowed," he said, "but the jury will be instructed to consider it carefully and without assumption." The room felt smaller as the lights dimmed once more. The recording began abruptly. There was no introduction, no calm explanation, just breathless Faye. "He's outside," Elena whispered. "I can hear him moving." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. "It's not Daniel," she continued quickly. "Daniel left hours ago. I told him everything tonight." Daniel's hands trembled. His lawyer placed a steadying hand on his arm. "If anything happens to me," Elena said, her voice shaking, "please look at Marcus Hale." The recording ended with a sudden noise. A thud. Then silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Elena's mother let out a quiet sob, pressing her face into her husband's shoulder. The judge closed his eyes briefly before instructing the jury to remain seated. The defense did not object this time. There was nothing left to object to. The prosecutor waited before speaking again, allowing the weight of Elena's words to settle. Then she stood. "This recording," she said, "was never meant to be heard unless Elena Morris believed her life was in immediate danger." She named the man she feared most. And it was not her husband. The courtroom erupted into whispers before the judge restored order. The defense requested an immediate dismissal of charges. The judge denied it, stating that while the evidence raised serious doubt, the process must continue properly. But the direction was clear. The prosecution moved quickly. They presented updated phone data showing Marcus Hale's phone signal near Elena's apartment at the estimated time of death. His earlier claim of being home alone could not be verified. His alibi had cracks. A second search of Marcus's apartment was requested and approved. When the detective returned to the stand, his expression was different from before. Tighter. More serious. He testified that during the second search, investigators found a flash drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book. On it were dozens of audio files, all dated over several months, all labeled with times and locations. They were recordings of Elena. The courtroom reacted with disbelief and horror as one short clip was played. Elena's voice could be heard speaking to a co-worker, unaware she was being recorded. Another clip captured the sound of her unlocking her car, her footsteps fading away. Marcus Hale had been listening to her without her knowledge. The defense attorney for Daniel sat back slowly, his face pale. The prosecution had stopped building a case against Daniel and had begun dismantling it entirely. Marcus Hale was arrested before the day ended. The news spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering in disbelief. People who had once avoided Daniel's name now spoke it with shame. The following morning, Marcus was brought into custody. Footage of him being led into the station played on every local channel. His face was blank, his eyes empty. Under questioning, Marcus initially denied everything. He claimed the recordings were for a project. He said Elena had agreed. But when confronted with the emergency recording, his composure broke. He admitted to watching Elena. He admitted to following her. He admitted to entering her apartment that night. But he claimed he did not mean to kill her. He said he only wanted to talk. In court, the prosecutor presented his partial confession. Marcus admitted to being obsessed. He admitted to being there. He admitted to touching her. That was enough. The charges against Daniel Morris were formally dropped that afternoon. When the judge announced it, Daniel did not react right away. It took several seconds for the words to register. Then his body gave in. He lowered his head and cried openly, the sound raw and unfiltered. His lawyer wrapped an arm around him, but Daniel barely noticed. Elena's parents watched in silence. Relief and grief tangled together in their expressions. The man they had believed killed their daughter was innocent, but their daughter was still gone. Justice, it seemed, was not clean. It did not undo pain. It only redirected it. As Daniel walked out of the courthouse a free man, reporters surrounded him. Questions flew from every direction, but he said nothing. He stepped into the sunlight and paused, letting it touch his face. For the first time in months, he was not being led somewhere. Inside the courtroom, preparations began for a new trial. The wrong man had sat at the defense table. The dead woman had known it all along. And because she had spoken before she was silenced, the truth had finally found its way into the light. The courtroom felt different the day Marcus Hale's trial began. The air was quieter, heavier, as if everyone inside understood that this was no longer just a murder case. It was a reckoning. The same benches were filled, the same judge presided, but the energy had changed. There was no confusion now about who sat at the defense table. Marcus Hale stared straight ahead, his face unreadable, his hands folded tightly as if holding himself together by force alone. Outside, winter had begun to loosen its grip on Cedar Falls. Snow melted along the sidewalks, revealing streets that looked worn and tired, much like the people who lived there. The town had been forced to confront its own mistake. Many had judged too quickly. Many had chosen the easy answer over the careful one. Daniel Morris did not attend the trial on the first day. He couldn't. Freedom had not brought peace the way he imagined it would. He slept poorly, waking from dreams where Elena's voice called his name from places he could not reach. He was free, but the past still followed him closely. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor began by telling the jury who Elena Morris was, not how she died, but how she lived. She spoke about her love for books, her quiet kindness, her habit of leaving handwritten notes for students who struggled. She reminded the jury that Elena had not wanted attention, had not wanted to accuse without certainty. That was why she recorded her voice instead of telling her story out loud. The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. The recordings found on the flash drive showed a pattern of obsession that had grown darker with time. Experts testified that Marcus had installed recording software on shared computers at the school. He had used hidden devices to capture Elena's voice without her consent. He had followed her movements, memorized her schedule, learned her habits. One investigator described how Marcus knew which nights Elena stayed late, which parking spots she preferred, which routes she took home. It was not coincidence. It was control. The emergency recording was played again, this time in full. The jury listened as Elena whispered in fear. Her words rushed but clear. She was not guessing. She was warning. Marcus's defense tried to argue that obsession did not equal murder. They claimed the recordings were invasive but not violent. They suggested the confrontation went wrong, that panic led to tragedy. But the story unraveled under pressure. Forensic evidence showed signs of a struggle consistent with Elena trying to escape someone she knew but did not trust. Marcus's fingerprints were found on a lamp used as a weapon. Fibers from his jacket were discovered on Elena's clothing. His phone data placed him at the scene longer than he admitted. When Marcus took the stand, his voice shook at first. He spoke about loneliness, about feeling invisible. He said Elena was kind to him, that her kindness felt like hope. He claimed he never meant to hurt her. But under cross-examination, his words turned sharp. The prosecutor asked why he tried to access Elena's account after her death. Marcus hesitated. He said he was curious. The prosecutor asked why he tried to delete the emergency recording. He had no answer. The jury watched closely as his calm mask slipped. Anger flashed across his face when Elena's voice played again. Not grief. Not sadness. Anger. That moment sealed it. After 3 days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait felt endless. Elena's parents sat side by side, hands clasped, their faces drawn but determined. They had already lost their daughter. Now they waited to see if her voice would be believed one final time. The verdict came late in the afternoon. Guilty. Marcus Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no dramatic reaction from him. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had known all along. As he was led away, he did not look back. For Elena's parents, the verdict brought tears, but not relief. Justice had been served, but justice did not bring their daughter home. Still, they thanked the prosecutor quietly. They said Elena had always been careful, always thoughtful. Now they understood just how far that thoughtfulness had gone. News of the conviction spread quickly. National outlets picked up the story, calling it one of the most unusual cases in recent history. Commentators debated the ethics of posthumous testimony. Law schools studied the recordings. Advocacy groups discussed how technology could protect vulnerable people. Daniel Morris watched the coverage from his small apartment, where he had moved after being released. He avoided interviews. He avoided crowds. He spent most days walking aimlessly through the town, passing places he and Elena once shared. The coffee shop where she liked to sit by the window. The bookstore where she worked weekends during college. Every memory felt sharp. One evening, months after the trial ended, Daniel received a letter. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small USB drive. The letter was from the prosecutor. She explained that Elena had left one final message. It was scheduled to be delivered 1 year after the conclusion of the trial, regardless of the outcome. The service Elena used had followed her instructions precisely. The prosecutor wrote that she hesitated to share it, unsure who it was meant for. But after careful thought, she believed Daniel should hear it. That night, Daniel sat alone and plugged the drive into his computer. Elena's face appeared on the screen this time, not just her voice. The video quality was simple, the lighting soft. She looked tired, but calm. "If you're watching this," Elena said gently, "then something terrible happened, and something important went right." Daniel covered his mouth, tears streaming down his face. "I need you to know something," Elena continued. "I never wanted anyone to suffer because of me. I especially never wanted you to be blamed for something you didn't do." She paused, taking a slow breath. "I trusted you," she said. "That's why I told you everything that night. I needed you to be safe, too." Daniel remembered that night now with painful clarity. Elena had been quiet, distracted. She had hugged him longer than usual before he left. At the time, he thought she was just anxious. "I was afraid," Elena said. "But I was also prepared. If you're free, if the truth came out, then my voice did its job." She smiled softly. "Live," she said. "That's all I want." The video ended. Daniel sat in silence long after the screen went dark. For the first time since her death, the weight on his chest eased slightly. Elena had not only saved herself from being silenced, she had saved him, too. A year later, Cedar Falls unveiled a small memorial in the town library. It was simple, just a plaque near the reading area Elena once managed. It read, "In memory of Elena Morris, who believed the truth should always be heard." People stopped there often. Some left flowers. Some left notes. Some simply stood in silence. The case changed laws in the state. New protections were introduced for digital testimony. Investigators received updated training on avoiding tunnel vision. Elena's story became a reminder of how easily the wrong person could be blamed, and how important it was to listen carefully. Elena Morris never walked into that courtroom. She never raised her hand or sat in the witness chair. But she testified. She spoke when it mattered most. And in the end, her voice reached further than anyone could have imagined, carrying the truth beyond the grave and into the light, where it could no longer be ignored.